Our topic is bias reversal in sleep and how it might work. As we've discussed throughout the course, bias exists throughout the world. Bias essentially affects how we perceive the world. In simple, we might have a tendency to prefer one political party over another, or one gender over another. We often see the presence of both implicit and explicit biases, implicit being those we are unaware of and unconsciously act on, and explicit being those we are aware of. These biases may serve to shape our behaviors, and sometimes those behaviors are not what we hope to see in society. An example may include bias in police or gender bias during the hiring process. So, we go on to discuss a study that suggests how bias and extinction of such bias has been seen in experiments. Some biases may hold more ground than others, as noted in both graphs. Graph A looks at the distinction between fear relevant and fear irrelevant, whereas Graph B looks at the distinction between racial in-group and racial out-group. Graph A displays the extinction for fear irrelevant groups and not complete extinction for fear relevant groups, whereas Graph B displays the fear extinction for the racial in-group rather than fear extinction for the racial out-group. This suggests that we may hold stronger connections for learned biases rather than those simply introduced via experimentation. This brings about the need for greater memory consolidation of learned fear extinction for items that are heavily ingrained within our minds. So as displayed on the previous slide, we understand that some biases hold more ground than others. Why might this be? Well, first we introduce the concept of stereotypes. Oftentimes, these stereotypes have been developed as a mental shortcut to increase the efficiency of our cognitive function. While this may seem beneficial for the time being, it can have alternatively malevolent consequences. Another idea involves motivation to seek self-fulfillment. For instance, this leads to our favoring of our in-groups rather than our out-groups. Lastly, we have a continual presence of societal norms that impact or influence the biases that continually develop within our minds. A counter-stereotype is an object that serves to go against the mental pictures people commonly hold for it. It serves to go against stereotypes. Through this process, we seek to decrease social bias as seen in the graph. In 2008, Gawronski showed that counter-stereotype cases can reduce social bias. However, there is a difficulty in maintenance, especially when such biases are reinforced by television and other forms of media. So this graph looks at 11 popular television shows that show more negative behavior towards blacks than white characters, which can unconsciously influence individuals' bias. To understand the graph further, we look at mean race bias associations as a function of exposure to nonverbal bias. So we look at pro-white exposure, pro-black exposure, and control condition. Higher numbers on the y-axis indicate faster responses to positive versus negative targets. Error bars represent standard error of the mean. A note on this includes that a decrease in the social bias was only temporary fix. So now we continue to question, how can we consolidate memory of unlearned bias? So, before we continue on, we talk about this concept of a trans-theoretical model of change. On the left-hand side, we see a pre-contemplation phase, whereas on the right-hand side, we see the maintenance phase. The pre-contemplative phase is essentially where we are unaware of a powerful influence of unconscious factors on our reasoning, whereas the maintenance phase is where we hope to be or what we hope to achieve in terms of cognitive debiasing and being able to exhibit logical reasoning. So, with this, we talk about memory consolidation. Memory consolidation is the strengthening of information in our mind. While the strengthening of synaptic connections during sleep can aid in memory consolidation, repetitive activation of information during sleep can help in strengthening memory. So now we ask our new question, can sleep help in counter-stereotyping or learning bias reversal?
There's known to be an interaction between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex during memory consolidation. This interaction supports the addition of new information and new memories with previously learned knowledge or schemas, and how these schemas are adjusted with new information. And as we know, schemas play a large role in implicit bias. As you can see on the picture, there are two basic streams of information flow from the prefrontal cortex to the hippocampus and back, the what pathway and the where pathway. each of which take different routes but ultimately converge in the hippocampus. Hippocampal neuron firing rates are spatially and temporally organized based on these inputs, which allows for the acquisition of memory and the replay of these sequences at later points in time. Replay of experiences by hippocampal neurons is thought to play a role in memory consolidation. Specifically, sleep might promote the transfer of memories from the hippocampus to the cortex. This study recorded spiking activity in the visual cortex and the hippocampal CA1 area in rats during maze running and sleep. The procedure begins when 4 rats were trained to sleep for 1 to 2 hours. They then alternated between 2 trajectories on the maze, either left or right. They slept again for 1 to 2 hours. This was repeated over several trials. Now we will go over the results. First, the study found that there were oscillating synchronized patterns of firing during slow-wave sleep in both the hippocampus and the cortex. Second, hippocampal neurons and cortical neurons were likely to be activated during sleep in a temporal sequence similar to the awake sequence found when they were doing the specific task, either moving in the left or right direction. Third, levels of pre-experienced sleep replay were higher in the cortex following repeated training. Now looking over on the graph on the left, we see in part A that the cortical and the hippocampal inputs are randomly and not sequentially firing. Next, we go to part B, and we see ordered cortical inputs corresponding to the ordered and sequential hippocampal neuron firing. Finally, in part C, we see the, again, coordinated hippocampal firing. The orange arrow represents the information from the hippocampus going back up to the cortex. Finally, we'll go over some conclusions about this experiment. The main idea of this experiment was that experiences are played during sleep in both brain regions, the hippocampus and the cortex, and replay in these 2 areas occurs in a synchronous, cyclic pattern of firing that reflects that activity that they performed when they were awake. This occurs only during slow-wave sleep. Now, the hypothesis as to why this occurred is because of the repetitive firing pattern during sleep is able to integrate new information from the hippocampus with learned information from the cortex and strengthening those cortical synapses. At the same time, information in the hippocampus is erased, making it ready to add new memories. And this was reflected by the activity of the hippocampal neurons, which stop replaying that experiences that they did when they were awake after about 1 hour, explaining that slow-wave sleep could contribute to this memory erasing in the hippocampus. And as it is known, the hippocampus and the cortex play these complementary roles in memory formation and storage, the cortex doing long-term memory and the hippocampus reflecting the short-term memory. As previously mentioned, the consolidation is proposed to involve the transfer of temporarily stored information from the hippocampus to the cortex for this long-term storage. And how this occurs is still unknown. However, this experiment provides support for a novel mechanism of consolidation using sleep.
A study using this method was performed by the WHO group. In order to give you an example of what a participant in this study would have done, I have brought Jack and Jill in. Jack and Jill are going to take an implicit bias test on the computer to assess their implicit bias, and then we'll go through a series of tests to help reduce their bias responses. Let's take a look at the test that Jack and Jill will be taking. To get a baseline score, Jack and Jill will take a normal IAT test to determine their bias to associate gender to science terms or art terms, and another test to determine their bias to associate race with good terms or bad terms. Following their baseline testing, they will enter the pre-nap phase, where they will see similar pairings but will be asked to only respond to counter-stereotypical pairings, and in response, hear a tone cue. For example, they would press when they see the picture of a woman and the word math. Or they would press when they see the picture of a racial outgroup and the word sunshine. They will follow with another test that plays the sound, and they must select the correct pairing. This allows them to form a strong association between the noise and the type of counter-bias training. Let's take a look at the results from Jack and Jill's counter-bias training. Wow, look at that improvement! Jack and Jill show a much lower implicit bias score after the counter-bias training. Now, Jack and Jill will enter the nap phase, where one of the two noise cues will be played for Jill and no noise for Jack. Then they will repeat the IAT test again. Here are their results. We see a significantly decreased implicit bias score as a result of Jill's cued sleep. Jack and Jill will return 1 week later for a follow-up and retake the test. Let's look at their results. This is great! Jill's results show that her score has not significantly been changed from her pre-nap score, and it is significantly lower than her baseline. The same cannot be said for Jack. Thank you, Jack and Jill, for your help! Sleep bias training can be used to help decrease bias in the community and prevent implicit bias from affecting our future choices. Our society has many racial biases. For example, it has been shown that police officers are more likely to shoot an unarmed black individual than an unarmed white individual. People also place less trust in black individuals as opposed to white individuals. However, race isn't the only area where people are biased. Gender bias also exists. We see that men are preferentially hired over female candidates. It has also been shown that there is a gender gap in the sciences, which correlates with stereotyping levels against females. While there are many other social biases that we still need to tackle, these are a few that sleep bias training could help decrease in our society today, leading to a healthier and more positive community.